The final trial took place in the deepest chamber of the Hall of Ancestors, where the armor stood waiting like a patient god. And every noble in the empire had gathered once more to witness what they were certain would be the humans' final moments. Do-hyun walked through the silent crowd with his head held high, his body still aching from wounds that had not fully healed, and he felt no fear whatever happened next. He had already proven something that could never be taken away. The high priest met him at the base of the armor's pedestal, his ancient face grave with the weight of the ritual he was about to perform. "The trial of wisdom is the most dangerous of the three," he said. "You will be connected directly to the armor's memory core, where the consciousness of every previous wearer exists in a state between life and death. They will judge you, human, and their judgment cannot be appealed." "I understand," Do-hyun replied. "If they find you worthy, you will emerge transformed, bound to the armor until your death." The priest continued. "If they find you unworthy, your mind will be destroyed, leaving your body an empty shell." "I understand," Do-hyun said. Again, the priest nodded and stepped aside. Gesturing for Do-hyun to approach the armor, he climbed the pedestal steps slowly, feeling the weight of thousands of years pressing down on him. And when he placed his hands on the armor's chest, the world dissolved into light. He found himself standing in a space that was not a space, surrounded by figures that were not quite real. The ghosts of every warrior who had worn this armor stretching back to the dawn of the Valorian Empire. They regarded him with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. These legendary heroes, whose names were written in stars. And Do-hyun stood before them knowing that nothing he said could convince them of his worth. He would simply have to show them. The memories came then. Not his memories, but theirs, flooding through his mind like a river breaking through a dam. He lived 1,000 lives in what might have been seconds or centuries, felt the triumph of victories and the agony of defeats, knew the weight of crowns and the loneliness of command, understood what it meant to protect an empire and what it cost to protect it. And through all those lives, he found a thread that connected every wearer who had come before. Not strength, not skill, not bloodline or birth compassion. Every true wearer of the armor had been chosen not because they could destroy enemies, but because they would do anything to protect the innocent. Not because they conquered worlds, but because they built bridges between them. Not because they knew how to fight, but because they knew when not to. The War Queen herself appeared before him then, more real than the others. And her face was not the cold mask of legend, but the tired eyes of someone who had carried too much for too long. "My people remember me as a conqueror," she said, her voice echoing through the space between worlds. "They tell stories of my victories and the enemies I destroyed. But they have forgotten why I fought." "Why did you fight?" Do-hyun asked. "To end fighting," she replied. "Every war one waged was to prevent a greater war. Every enemy I defeated was someone I tried to reach through peace first. I built this armor not to create warriors, but to find souls who would carry my burden. Souls who would see enemies as future allies and fight without hatred. Your people have forgotten this," Do-hyun said. "They have," the queen agreed. "They see strength and call it virtue. They see conquest and call it glory. They have forgotten that true power lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the choice not to." She reached out and touched Do-hyun's face, her fingers as gentle as starlight. "You saved creatures you had never seen because you could not bear to let the innocent die," she said. "You refused to yield against the champion because giving up would have meant betraying the faith I placed in you. You came here knowing you would probably die because it was right, not because it was safe." "I am not a warrior," Do-hyun said. "I do not know how to be what you need. You already are what I need," the queen replied. "My people have forgotten how to see worth in those who do not look like them, how to build alliances instead of empires, how to protect without conquering. You will remind them." She stepped back, and the other spirits gathered around her. Their expressions transformed from judgment to acceptance. "Kim Do-yoon of Earth," the War Queen said. "The armor of Saranthas accepts your bond. Rise now as Kethvisor, sole guardian of the Empire, and teach my children what I could not." The light consumed him, and he fell upward into a darkness that was warm and welcoming and full of whispered promises when Do-yoon opened his eyes. He was standing in the Hall of Ancestors, and the armor was no longer on its pedestal. It was on him. The ancient metal fit like a second skin, lighter than air and stronger than anything he had ever known. And he could feel the War Queen's presence at the edge of his consciousness, a companion who would guide him through whatever came next. The crowd had gone utterly silent, every Valorian staring at the impossible sight of a human clad in the most sacred armor in their history. The Emperor rose from his throne and descended to stand before Do-yoon, his expression unreadable. "The trial is complete," the High Priest announced, his voice trembling with awe. "The armor has accepted its new wearer." For a long moment, no one moved, and Do-yoon wondered if the Emperor would reject what had happened, if the entire Empire would refuse to accept a human as guardian of their most precious legacy. Then Velith stepped forward from the crowd. She walked to where Do-yoon stood and knelt before him, her head bowed, her pride broken and rebuilt into something stronger. "Kethvisor," she said, using the title that marked him as the armor's true bearer. "I was wrong about you, about your people, about what strength truly means." She looked up at him with eyes that held no hatred, only the raw honesty of someone who has been forced to confront their own limitations. "I ask permission to serve as your liaison," she continued, "to learn what you can teach about seeing worth in those who are different." Do-yoon reached down and raised her to her feet. "Not as servant," he said, "but as partner. The Empire needs more than one guardian, and I think you have the soul for it." The Emperor smiled then, a small expression that transformed his stern face into something almost warm. "Perhaps the armor chose wisely after all," he said. "You do not seek power or glory. You seek only to protect and to build bridges where others would build walls." He turned to address the assembled nobles. "Let it be known throughout the Empire," he declared. "Kim Do-yoon of Earth is hereby named Kethvisor, sole guardian of the Valorian Empire, not as ruler or warrior, but as counselor and conscience, a voice that will remind us of the values we have forgotten." The crowd responded with something between shock and acceptance, and Do-yoon knew that many would never see him as legitimate, that the road ahead would be difficult in ways he could not yet imagine. But standing there in armor that had chosen him against all odds, with the princes at his side who had transformed from enemy to ally, he felt ready for whatever came next. 3 months later, human and Valorian diplomats gathered in the Imperial Palace to negotiate the first true alliance between their peoples. Do-yoon stood beside the throne, his armor quiet on his shoulders, watching as two species took the first steps toward partnership instead of mere tolerance. And somewhere in the depths of his consciousness, the War Queen smiled. Her children were finally learning the lesson she had died trying to teach them. True strength was not measured by the enemies you could destroy. It was measured by the friends you could make. The Death Moon Velcathar was everything Valith had promised, and worse. Do-yoon emerged from the drop pod into air that burned his lungs with every breath, his environmental suit the only thing standing between him and immediate death, and looked out across a landscape that seemed designed by nightmares. The ground was black and jagged, volcanic rock that had cooled into shapes like frozen screams, and the sky above was a sickly green that cast everything in a light that made his eyes ache. He had 3 days to survive here, with minimal supplies and no weapons beyond a simple knife. And the moment his drop pod sealed itself and rocketed back toward orbit, he understood that the Valorians had never expected him to return. For the first day, he focused on finding shelter, using the geological survey data he had memorized to locate a cave system that, would protect him from both the temperature drops and the predators that emerged after dark. The creatures that hunted on Velcather were called shadow stalkers by the Valorians, and Do-yoon glimpsed them as the first night fell. Lean shapes that moved through the darkness with terrifying speed, their bodies producing no heat signature because they were cold-blooded hunters that had evolved to track warm prey. He pressed himself into the deepest part of his cave and did not sleep, listening to the sounds of the shadow stalkers moving past his hiding place, their claws clicking on the stone as they searched for the warm-blooded intruder they knew was somewhere nearby by the second day. He had established a pattern, moving during the hours when the temperature was most bearable, gathering what resources he could, and retreating to his cave before the predators emerged. It was during one of these gathering expeditions that he found the nest. The eggs were hidden in a crevice near a thermal vent, small and leathery, and clearly belonging to some native creature. And Do-hyun was about to pass by when he noticed the shadow stalker tracks surrounding them. The predators had found the nest and would return to destroy it, as they apparently destroyed any competing species they encountered. And the parent creature was nowhere to be seen. Likely already killed by the hunters, Do-hyun knew he should keep moving, knew that stopping for anything decreased his chances of survival, knew that these eggs meant nothing in the larger scheme of his mission, but he could not leave them. He spent 3 hours carefully moving the eggs to a new location near a different thermal vent, one that his survey data suggested was outside the shadow stalker's usual hunting territory. And he created a protective barrier around them from loose rocks that would shelter them from the cold. It was irrational, he knew, to risk his life for creatures he had never seen and would never see again. But something in him refused to let the innocent die when he could prevent it. Far above the moon, in a ship that monitored his every movement, Lilith watched this display with an expression that shifted from confusion to something she could not name. She had expected the human to fight, to hide, to do whatever was necessary to save himself. And instead he was wasting precious time and energy on creatures that could offer him nothing in return. Why? She whispered to herself. Why would he do this? On the third day, Do-hyun faced his greatest challenge. He had been moving toward his extraction point when the ground beneath him gave way, dropping him into a sinkhole that left him with a twisted ankle and no way to climb out. The walls were too smooth, the opening too high, and his supplies were scattered at the bottom of the hole where he could not reach them. Night was coming, and with it the shadow stalkers. Do-hyun sat in the darkness of that hole and accepted that he was probably going to die. He had done everything he could, had survived longer than anyone expected, and now his luck had simply run out. But as the temperature dropped and the first stars appeared in the poisonous sky above, he heard something moving at the edge of the sinkhole. A creature appeared at the rim, looking down at him with eyes that reflected the starlight. And Do-hyun recognized it immediately as the parent of the eggs he had saved. A low-slung reptilian thing with 6 legs and a snout filled with blunt teeth. It chirped at him, a sound that seemed almost questioning, and then it did something extraordinary. It began dropping vines into the hole, the same thermal vines that grew near the vents where Do-hyun had hidden the eggs. And it kept dropping them until there was enough for him to climb. He ascended slowly, painfully, his injured ankle screaming with every movement. And when he reached the top, the creature pressed its snout against his hand in a gesture that felt almost like gratitude. Then it disappeared into the darkness, and Do-hyun limped toward his extraction point with tears freezing on his face. He reached the pickup location with an hour to spare, and when the ship descended to collect him, he collapsed inside with the knowledge that he had somehow survived the impossible. The second trial came 3 days later, after his injuries had been treated and his strength partially restored. This time he faced a champion, a Valorian warrior named Kethorus, who had never been defeated in formal combat, and the rules were simple. last as long as possible against an opponent who outmatched him in every conceivable way. The fight was over in less than 2 minutes. Cathoros struck Do-hyun again and again, each blow precise and devastating, and the human could do nothing but try to survive each attack long enough to face the next one. His ribs cracked, his arm broke, his vision blurred with blood from a cut above his eye, and still he refused to yield. The champion paused, confusion evident in his posture. "You can't win," Cathoros said. "Yield, and the pain ends." "No," Do-hyun replied, forcing himself back to his feet. The armor, which had been dormant since the choosing ceremony, suddenly flared to life on its pedestal at the edge of the arena, and a fragment of its power flowed into Do-hyun, not enough to fight, not enough to win, just enough to keep him standing. He raised his broken arm and faced the champion with eyes that refused to surrender. Cathoros struck him again, and again, and again, and each time Do-hyun fell, he rose once more, sustained by something beyond physical strength. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but was only minutes, the champion stepped back and lowered his weapon. "Enough," Cathoros said, and his voice held something that had not been there before. "I yield this match." A gasp rippled through the watching crowd. "You cannot yield," one of the judges protested. "You were winning." "I was beating a man who had already won," the champion replied, looking at Do-hyun with respect that bordered on reverence. "Any warrior can defeat an enemy, but only a true soul can refuse to be defeated." He bowed to Do-hyun, the formal bow of one warrior to another, and walked from the arena. Valith found Do-hyun in the medical bay that night, his body wrapped in healing fields that would repair the damage the champion had inflicted. "Why did you not yield?" she asked, and her voice carried none of its former mockery. Do-hyun looked at her with eyes that held no anger, only exhaustion. "Because giving up would mean the armor was wrong about me," he said, "and I will not let it be wrong." Valith stood there for a long moment, staring at this impossible human who had survived a death world and earned a champion's respect through nothing but his refusal to surrender. "The final trial is tomorrow," she said finally. "You will enter the armor's memory core and face the consciousness of every wearer who came before." "And if I fail?" Do-hyun asked. "You die," she replied. "But at this point, I am beginning to think you do not know how to do that." She left him then, but there was no hatred in her departure, only confusion and the beginning of something that might have been understanding. The scholars worked through the night and into the next day, their instruments probing the armor's memory crystals, while Do-hyun remained in his comfortable prison and wondered if he would ever see Earth again when the summons finally came. He was escorted not to the throne room but to a small chamber deep within the palace, where the emperor waited with his advisors and his daughter, whose eyes promised murder the moment they landed on Do-hyun. "We have examined the armor," the lead scholar announced, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "And what we have discovered will require us to reconsider everything we believed about the ancestral bonding." "Speak plainly," the emperor commanded. "The armor did not reject Princess Valith because she was unworthy," the scholar said. "It rejected her because its criteria for selection are not what we assumed them to be." He gestured to a holographic display that filled the center of the room with swirling patterns of light and data. "For 12,000 years, we believed the armors chose their wearers based on bloodline, that only those of royal descent could form the bond, and that the strength of one's lineage determined the strength of the connection. This is known," Valith said impatiently. "What does it have to do with the human's treachery?" "There was no treachery," the scholar replied, and his words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water. "The armor's memory crystals contain records dating back to its creation, and those records tell a different story entirely." The holographic display shifted to show a Valorian figure, ancient and regal, working at a forge that burned with impossible colors. The armors were created by the first queen herself, and she designed them to select their wearers based not on blood, but on what she called kethvol, the scholar continued. A term that has no direct translation, but means something like the weight of one's spirit or the depth of one's soul. What does that mean? The emperor asked. It means the armors choose those whose inner nature matches the purpose for which they were created, the scholar explained. The War Queen's armor was forged to protect, to defend, to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. And it seeks a wearer whose spirit resonates with that purpose. And you are saying that this human possesses this quality more strongly than my daughter. The emperor's voice was carefully neutral. I am saying that the armor believes so, the scholar replied. And in 12,000 years, the armors have never been wrong. Vila's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. Then I invoke the trial of worth. A ripple of shock passed through the advisors, and even the emperor's composure cracked for a moment. Daughter, he said slowly, do you understand what you are asking? I understand perfectly, Valith replied, her eyes fixed on Do-Yun with cold determination. The trial of worth was created for exactly this situation, to test whether the armor's choice was true. If the human survives the 3 trials, then his bond is proven legitimate. If he fails, he dies, and the armor returns to dormancy until a true heir claims it. The trial has not been invoked in 6,000 years. One of the advisors protested, and no one has ever survived it. Then the human will die and this embarrassment will be ended. Valith said simply. All eyes turned to Do-Yun, who had listened to this exchange with growing horror as he realized that his fate was being decided without any input from him at all. Does the human accept the trial? The emperor asked. Or does he renounce his claim to the armor? Do-Yun's mind raced through his options, but there were really only 2. Accept the trial and probably die, or refuse and definitely die, because renouncing the armor's choice would be seen as admitting guilt, and the Valorians would execute him for the desecration he had supposedly committed. I accept, he said, and his voice did not shake. Though he had no idea where that courage came from, the emperor nodded slowly, and something in his expression might have been respect. Then the trial of worth will commence in 3 days. And Valith, he turned to his daughter with a look that brooked no argument. You will serve as the human's observer, accompanying him through each trial to verify that the results are legitimate. Father, Valith began to protest. This is not a request, the emperor said. You invoked the trial. You will bear witness to its outcome. Perhaps in doing so you will learn something about the qualities the armor values. Valith's jaw tightened, but she bowed her head in acceptance. As you command. The next 3 days were the strangest of Do-Yun's life. He was released from his cell and given quarters in the royal wing, with access to training facilities and combat instructors who regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. He trained from dawn until exhaustion claimed him, learning what he could about Valorian combat techniques, though he knew it was hopeless. Knew that nothing could prepare a human to face trials designed to test warriors who had trained since childhood. Valith observed his training in silence, her presence a constant reminder of the hatred she bore him. And for the first 2 days, she did not speak a single word to him. On the 3rd day, she found him alone in the training hall, practicing forms that he knew he would never master. And she watched him fail again and again with an expression he could not read. Why do you keep trying? She asked finally. The first words she had spoken to him since the ceremony. Do-Yun lowered his practice weapon and turned to face her, sweat dripping down his face, his muscles screaming from overuse. Because giving up means dying, he replied. You are going to die anyway, she said. Not cruelly, just stating what she saw as obvious fact. No human could survive the trial of worth. You lack the strength, the speed, the training. You are fighting a battle you cannot win. Maybe, Do-Yun agreed. But I will not stop fighting until the battle is over. Something flickered in her eyes. There and gone too quickly to identify. The first trial begins tomorrow, she said. You will be sent to the death moon Velcather and left there for 3 days. The moon's atmosphere is toxic to most species. Its surface is covered with predators that hunt by heat signature, and the temperature drops below freezing at night. And the goal? Do-Yun asked. Survival? Valeth replied. Simply survive for 3 days, and you pass. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it is worth, human. I hope you prove me wrong about your species. Then she was gone, and Do-Yun was left alone with his exhaustion and his fear and the knowledge that tomorrow he would face the first of 3 trials designed to kill him. He closed his eyes and reached out with something he could not name, searching for the armor that had chosen him, hoping for guidance or reassurance or anything that might help him understand why he had been selected for this impossible task. And somewhere in the palace, he felt something answer. The bonding ceremony was the most important event in a young royal's life, and every noble in the empire had gathered to witness Princess Valeth claim her grandmother's armor. The Hall of Ancestors had been transformed for the occasion, with thousands of floating lights drifting through the air like captured stars, musicians playing instruments that produced sounds no human throat could make, and a crowd so vast that it spilled out into the corridors beyond. Do-Yun had been released without punishment after his accidental trespass, the Emperor himself dismissing the incident as a misunderstanding that required no further action. And now he stood at the back of the hall with the other Meyer diplomats. Watching history unfold, Valeth was radiant in ceremonial robes of deep purple and silver, her head held high as she walked down the central aisle toward the armor that had belonged to War Queen Sorrenthus, the greatest warrior the Empire had ever known. The armor stood on its pedestal like a sleeping god, ancient and terrible and beautiful. And Valeth approached it with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything in her life. Daughter of the blood, the high priest intoned, his voice amplified to fill the massive chamber. You come before the armor of your ancestors to seek the bond that will define your destiny. I come to claim what is mine by right, Valeth responded, and her voice rang with absolute certainty. She placed her hands on the armor's chest and closed her eyes, reaching out with whatever sense the Valorians used to commune with these ancient artifacts. The hall held its breath. Seconds passed, then minutes, and Do-Yun watched confusion begin to spread across Valeth's face. Watched her brow furrow with effort, watched her press harder against the armor as if she could force it to respond. Nothing happened. The armor remained cold and dark and utterly silent. Valeth stepped back, her face pale beneath her iridescent skin, and the whispers began almost immediately, spreading through the crowd like fire through dry grass. The armor rejects her, someone near Do-Yun murmured. This has not happened in 3,000 years. Valeth's hands were shaking as she reached for the armor again, desperation creeping into her movements. But before she could touch it, the armor did something that stopped every heart in the room. It moved. The ancient metal groaned as limbs that had not stirred in centuries came to life, as eyes that had been dark since the death of the War Queen began to glow with pale blue light. As the armor stepped down from its pedestal, for the first time in living memory, Valeth stumbled backward, her face a mask of shock, and the crowd parted like water before the armor's advance. It walked slowly through the hall, past nobles who stood frozen in disbelief, past guards who did not dare to raise their weapons against an artifact more sacred than any temple, past the Emperor himself who watched with an expression that might have been fear. It stopped in front of Kim Do-Yun, and it knelt. The silence that followed was so complete that Do-Yun could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. could feel the weight of 10,000 stares pressing down on him, could see his own terrified reflection in the armor's ancient faceplate. "That is not possible." Velith's voice cut through the silence, high and sharp with fury. "This is some kind of trick, some human deception. Seize him immediately." Guards moved to obey, weapons drawn. But the armor rose to its feet and turned to face them. And something in its posture made them hesitate. "Hold," the Emperor commanded. And his voice carried an authority that stopped everyone in their tracks. "No one will touch the human until we understand what has happened here." "Father," Velith protested, "this creature has somehow corrupted the armor. He must have planted some device when he trespassed into the hall. This cannot be allowed to stand. The armor has not been touched by human hands," the high priest said, his voice shaking as he stared at readings from instruments Do-Hyun could not identify. Its memory crystals confirmed that it activated on its own, responding to something it sensed in this room. "Then the human did something," Velith insisted. "He must have. This is impossible." "Many things that seem impossible are merely unexpected," the Emperor said, and his amber eyes fixed on Do-Hyun with an intensity that made the human want to flee. "Bring the scholars. Bring everyone who has ever studied the ancestral armors. I want answers before this day is done." Do-Hyun found his voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I did not do anything, I swear it. I do not understand what is happening. Then you will remain in protective custody until we determine the truth," the Emperor said. "And if we discover that this was indeed some form of sabotage, you will wish the guards had killed you where you stand." The armor turned to look at Do-Hyun one more time, and he could feel something radiating from it. Not hostility or threat, but something almost like recognition. Almost like welcome. Then guards surrounded him, careful not to actually touch him while the armor remained so close, and led him away from the ruined ceremony and the princess whose dreams had just been shattered. As he was escorted through the corridors, he heard Velith's voice behind him, cold and hard and filled with a hatred that made him shiver. "I will expose whatever you have done, human, and when I do, I will destroy you myself." Do-Hyun did not respond, because he had no response to give. He had never touched the armor, had never spoken to it, had done nothing except walk into a room where he did not belong and feel something watching him in the darkness. But somehow, impossibly, the armor of the greatest warrior in Valorian history had chosen him, and he had absolutely no idea why. The cell they placed him in was comfortable enough. More guest quarters than prison, but the locked door and armed guards made its true purpose clear. Do-Hyun sat on the bed and stared at his hands. Ordinary human hands that had never held a weapon more dangerous than a kitchen knife, and tried to understand how his life had gone so wrong so quickly. He had come here to observe and learn, to be invisible and forgettable, to serve out his posting and return home with nothing more exciting to report than descriptions of alien architecture. Now he was at the center of a scandal that could spark a war between species. The door opened, and a Valorian scholar entered, ancient and bent with age, but with eyes that burned with fierce intelligence. "Tell me everything," the scholar demanded. "From the moment you first entered the Hall of Ancestors to the moment the armor knelt before you." And Do-Hyun told him, leaving nothing out, because he had nothing to hide. What he did not know was that the armor had already told its own story, recorded in the memory crystals that the scholars were even now decoding, and what they found there would change everything. Kim Do-Hyun stood at the edge of the grand reception hall and tried to make himself invisible, which was difficult when every alien in the room stood 7 feet tall and had skin that shimmered like oil on water. The Valorian Imperial Palace was everything the briefings had promised and more, with walls of living crystal that sang soft harmonies when the wind passed through them, floors inlaid with metals that humans had no names for, and ceilings so high they disappeared into artificial clouds that drifted through the upper chambers. He was the only human in the room. A cultural attach sent as part of a minor diplomatic exchange that nobody on either side took seriously. And he understood perfectly well why he had been chosen for this assignment. He was expendable. The Valorian Empire had ruled this sector of the galaxy for 12,000 years before humanity had figured out how to make fire. And they viewed humans the way humans might view particularly clever dogs, amusing, occasionally useful, but certainly not equals. Do-Hyun adjusted his formal uniform and watched the Valorian nobles glide past him without acknowledgement, their iridescent skin catching the light in ways that made them look like living artwork, their movements graceful in a manner that made human motion seem clumsy by comparison. He had been standing alone for nearly an hour when she approached. Princess Vali the Saranthas was beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, sharp and cold and designed for a single purpose. And when her amber eyes fixed on Do-Hyun, he felt like prey that had just been spotted by a predator. "So this is the human they sent us," she said, and her voice carried across the hall with deliberate volume, drawing the attention of nearby nobles, who turned to watch with undisguised amusement. Do-Hyun bowed in the Valorian fashion, one hand over his heart, his head lowered for exactly 3 seconds as protocol demanded. "Your Highness," he said, keeping his voice calm and respectful. "It is an honor to be received at your court." Valith circled him slowly, her long silver hair trailing behind her like a cape, her expression one of open contempt. "An honor," she repeated, and several nobles laughed at her tone. "Yes, I suppose it must be quite overwhelming for a soft walker to stand in these halls." Soft walker was what the Valorians called humans, a reference to the fact that humans came from a world with lower gravity than the Valorian homeworld. And it was not meant as a compliment. "My world has its own beauty, Your Highness," Do-Hyun replied, "though I admit your palace is unlike anything I have ever seen." "Your world," Vela said, stopping directly in front of him and looking down from her considerable height advantage, "is a backwater planet that discovered space travel while my ancestors were building empires that spanned 1,000 stars. And you stand here as a guest only because my father believes in showing charity to lesser species." The hall had gone quiet now, every noble watching to see how the human would respond to this open insult from a princess of the blood. Do-Hyun met her eyes without flinching. Though his heart was pounding so hard, he was certain she could hear it. "Your father is wise to value diplomacy over pride," he said quietly, "and I am grateful for his hospitality." Something flickered in Vela's expression, perhaps surprise that he had not crumbled under her assault, perhaps annoyance that he had turned her insult into a compliment for her father. "We shall see how long that hospitality lasts," she said, and swept away without another word, leaving Do-Hyun standing alone once more as the nobles returned to their conversations. He released a slow breath and wondered how he was going to survive. 3 years in this place. The following week passed in a blur of ceremonial functions and diplomatic meetings where Do-Hyun sat in the back and took notes that nobody would ever read. And he learned quickly that his role here was decorative at best. The Valorians had no interest in what humanity had to offer, no curiosity about human culture or history or achievements, and Do-Hyun found himself spending most of his free time exploring the palace, simply because there was nothing else to do. It was during one of these explorations that he found the Hall of Ancestors. He had taken a wrong turn, somewhere in the residential wing, following a corridor that grew darker and older as he walked, until he stood before a pair of massive doors carved with symbols he did not recognize. The doors were not locked, which should have been his first warning. The hall beyond was vast and silent, lit only by the soft glow of crystals embedded in the walls. And Do-Hyun's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was looking at. Armor rows upon rows of ancient armor stood on pedestals throughout the hall, each suit different from the last, each one radiating a presence that made the air feel thick and heavy. These were the ancestral armors, the legendary suits that had been passed down through the Valorian royal line for millennia, living artifacts that chose their own wearers through a bonding ritual that no outsider had ever witnessed. Do-hyun knew he should leave immediately, that his presence here could cause a diplomatic incident that would end his career and possibly his life. But something held him in place. The armor at the far end of the hall was watching him. He could not explain how he knew this, could not point to any visible eyes or sensors that tracked his movement. But the certainty settled into his bones like cold water. The armor was ancient, even by Valorian standards, its surface marked with patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living things. And Do-hyun felt a pull toward it that he could not name or understand. He took one step forward, then another, moving without conscious decision, drawn by something beyond his comprehension. Human. The voice cracked through the silence like thunder, and Do-hyun spun to find a Valorian guard standing in the doorway, weapon raised, eyes blazing with fury. "This hall is forbidden to all but the royal blood," the guard snarled. "And your presence here is an act of desecration that will not go unpunished." Do-hyun raised his hands in surrender, his mind racing for an explanation that would not result in his immediate execution. "I was lost," he said, which was true. "I meant no disrespect, and I will leave immediately." The guard seized him roughly and dragged him from the hall, and Do-hyun did not resist, knowing that any struggle would only make things worse. But as he was pulled through the doors, he looked back one last time at the armor that had watched him, and he could have sworn it nodded.